Before we get to the video, I'd just like to ask you to stay a while. I made it for you guys so you could take a few minutes out of your busy lives, relive some of the glory days, and just remember what these early days of gaming meant to you. It might bring back memories of family and old friends you haven't seen in a very long time. Seeing these games might conjure up flashbacks of old dens, TV rooms, and basements. Everyone's in such a rush these days. I could have just made this a clip show and made it 30 seconds, but I do these videos like this for a reason. Think of it like a visual podcast. Just grab your favorite beverage and hunker down for a few minutes. So I hope you take a moment to relax, stay for the duration, and enjoy. And if you'd comment, sub, or like it, that would mean a lot. Thank you. Welcome to Moxxi's Mancade. In this episode of Backed by Popular Demand, which will eventually be worth millions if you can find a sealed copy, stored in Aunt Gassie's junk drawer for 30 years, and then have it graded by WADA with a rating of 9.8 A++, it's time to turn the tables and reveal the Super Nintendo games Sega hated because they were all about that Wild Mode 7 and didn't even need to be filtered through blast processing. When Capcom's sequel to Street Fighter hit arcades in February '91, it caused a ripple effect that saw gamers around the world crawl out of their cushy home console lairs and find their way back to the arcades they had abandoned just a few years earlier. Street Fighter 2 created such a buzz back then that playing that game turned into like a bloody commitment, like piano lessons. Every spare chance I got, I drove over to the local arcade, jammed my quarters into an SF2 cab, and played the out of it. And I still sucked quarter after quarter, dollar after dollar, week after week, month after month. I'd still get mine handed to me by some random player too. Some players knew the cool special moves, but I played Street Fighter 2 like Ralph Hinckley from The Greatest American Hero. I had no idea how to make this machine work and like no manuals to study. How did I do that fireball move? Wait, how did he just triple flip kick me? There was no internet to check, and the goof that slammed his quarters aggressively onto the bezel wasn't going to tell you all the special moves. When I caught wind that Street Fighter 2 was coming out of the SNES, I was ecstatic. No more driving to the arcade in the stabby part of town. No more training my lungs to suck just the oxygen out of the air while ignoring the secondhand smoke. No more looking for quarters in the dirty part of the couch. No more telling my girlfriend I was having an affair just so I could get an evening alone with Street Fighter 2. And no more D-bags slamming their quarters onto that bezel. Street Fighter 2 launched on the Super Nintendo on July 15th, 1992, and I was there on launch day, you can believe it. Was it arcade perfect? To me, yeah. Was it really? No. But it didn't matter because, man, it was close enough. You could even enter a code and play versus the same player, something the arcade couldn't do. I loved that game, and every Genesis-owning Sonic fanatic was green like Blanco with Street Fighter 2 envy because they wanted to love it too. And that's why Sega hated Street Fighter 2. Until Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition showed up a year later on the Genesis. Then all was forgiven. I love indie, you love indie. His Nazi punching adventures are a natural fit for video game hijinks. Indiana Jones' Greatest Adventures arrived on the Super Nintendo in '94 and allowed home console heroes a chance to step into the weathered leather jacket of archaeology's most well-known mass murderer. Hey, he'll kill whoever he wants, whenever he wants. That's Moses' Ark of the Covenant he's going after. You better get out of his way, because
you don't mess around with God's America.
You tell him, C.S. Lewis Jr. Good luck blowing up the moon. Factor 5 was in charge of development of Indy, and while the game takes some liberties with the license, not quite as many as the Back to the Future NES game, which was
mockery of a sham, of a mockery of a travesty of two mockeries of a sham.
But it keeps it entertaining throughout the 3 adventures. It seems Factor 5 kind of ran out of steam as they went along, as the game gets progressively shorter as you play the trilogy, but just be thankful it ends there and doesn't, nuke the fridge, if you catch my drift. Indiana Jones' Greatest Adventure is your typical side-scroller platforming game, but Factor 5 threw in some very cool minecart, snow surfing, and airplane Mode 7 levels, as well as some creative boss fights that weren't in the movies. Imagine getting the end of Raiders and your character is tied to a pole with your eyes closed so your face doesn't melt. Definitely challenging, fun, and back in the 90s was definitely what gamers were looking for. Sega gamers were kind of looking for it too, but they didn't get it. even though it was actually 100% completed, and Factor 5 actually did the port in-house. It was delayed a further 2 years after the Super Nintendo release, and eventually shelved altogether. And that's why Sega hated Indiana Jones' Greatest Adventures. Konami knows a thing or two about the beat-em-up genre. They brought us X-Men, Simpsons, TMNT, and incredibly, Batman Returns on the Super Nintendo. Michael Keaton's alter ego gets nuts, and I mean pretty much just goes to town on every thug, henchman, and boss in Gotham. I almost feel sorry for them. I mean, he's smashing their heads together, he's body slamming their necks into the cobblestone streets of Gotham, he's wall slamming their faces, and he's a tad unhinged throughout this whole thing. I'm sure he doesn't kill, but I'm betting some of these guys might not be able to do simple math or wipe themselves after Bats is through with them. Whereas most games in this genre are meant for 2 players, Batman Returns is beautifully balanced as a 1-player adventure. Challenging, but not punishing. It's also got an options menu with a player and difficulty select. The game features 7 levels ripped right out of the movie. You'll take on Penguin, Catwoman, and fans of Batman Returns will recognize a lot of the clown characters from the Red Triangle Circus gang featured in the film. Heck, it even tosses in a Batmobile Mode 7 ride through Gotham. The soundtrack, graphics, and controls were high-quality gaming perfection. Even though Batman Returns was released 10 months after the movie arrived in theaters, that did nothing to slow down the sales when it hit the street. Super Nintendo owners couldn't get enough. Even though Genesis owners received their own Batman Returns game, and it wasn't bad, it certainly wasn't Konami's version. And that's why Sega hated Batman Returns. The Castlevania series is a hellspawn money-sucking monster, existing only to separate your cash from your wallet forever, or at least until the next game comes out. Anyone who grew up in the 80s with an NES should be intimately familiar with the unlucky Belmont clan over there in Transylvania. And I'm going to say something controversial and admit that Castlevania 3 is actually my favorite from the series, but I did love Castlevania 4 and Symphony of the Night, which appeared later in life on the PS1 and gave us this classic.
What is a man? A miserable little pile of secrets. But enough talk. How about you?
And the Oscar goes to...
Not only does Castlevania 4 improve upon the entire formula the franchise was already known for, but the game's progression was much more inviting to players aware, of the Castlevania level of challenge. And the password feature was definitely a welcome addition. The whip physics were very cool at the time, and Konami ensured that the entire experience was tightened up with spot-on jumping controls and movement. Mode 7 effects were used to what I can only describe as epileptic death sentence levels, but awesome nonetheless, and without a doubt, one of the best soundtracks of all time, which if you've spent any time with Castlevania 4, it should be embedded into your brain meat. Little known fact, Factor 5, remember them, created a demo of this game running on the MegaDrive, but Konami was like, you know what? Anyone's gonna put Castlevania 4 to the Genesis, it's gonna be us. And we're not gonna bother. And that's why Sega hates Castlevania 4. And I'm not gonna lie, I kinda hate Konami for leaving Genesis owners behind on this one. Wait, what? A farming simulator on Super Nintendo? Wow! Do I grow it or buy it? I'm gonna put this out here right now. There is no way that Sega hated Harvest Moon when it debuted on the Super Nintendo in 96-97. So its inclusion on this list is suspect and perhaps unqualified to say the least. How could Sega hate this? They probably didn't even know it existed. If they did, do you think they were upset it wasn't on the Genesis? Doubtful. But there was something about this game that persevered. Like a seed, Harvest Moon blossomed into a well-respected franchise over the years and quite literally birthed the farming sim genre. I mean, farming simulation is not only a genre now, but that's the name of one of its most popular games. Without Harvest Moon, you definitely wouldn't have been shelling out big bucks for a Switch in Animal Crossing during the pandemic. Suckers! So Harvest Moon gets the nod for causing Sega's really slow burn over the last 25 years. And that's why Sega sorta, kinda, probably hates Harvest Moon. Heck, I hate it, and I actually never played it. Farming simulation. I live next door to Saskatchewan. I'm good. You know what I like farming? Alien Skull! Instead of farming for vegetables, give me video game tough guys kicking bubblegum and chewing ass any day, and they're all out of bubblegum, and I think I got that one mixed up. Anyway, Jimbo and Sully are our two intrepid... Jimbo and Sully? What happened to Bruce and Lance, or whatever their names are? Anyway, so these guys are our two intrepid heroes taking on the Red Falcon invasion of Earth in the year 2636 on Valentine's Day, no less. It says so in the manual. Jimbo and Sully ain't got no time for love and chocolates on this day. The fate of the planet is in their hands, and they'll have to see their loved ones after. Unless... Any NES gamer worth their salt knew the Contra series. It had serious street cred, so when Contra 3 showed up in March '92, less than a year after the Super Nintendo launched, actionaholics couldn't wait to get it. Contra 3 played more like an over-the-top, action-packed summer blockbuster than its previous iterations. Things were blowing up left and right, perspectives were changing, mid-level bosses stormed in, there were hoverbike action scenes jumping from missile to missile sections, and literal non-stop action for two players simultaneously. Contra 3 looked fantastic, had a bombastic soundtrack, and used the Super Nintendo hardware to its full advantage. What was not to love about this Alien Skull farming simulator? Sega owners did eventually get their envious little grubby mitts on the series, called Contra Hardcore, a couple of years later, which was well received but brutally difficult. For 2 frustratingly long years, Sega seethed while Super Nintendo consoles flew off the shelves so gamers could kick bubblegum and chew ass, and they're all out of bubblegum, and I screwed that up again. And that's why Sega hated Contra 3. This is a special entry because Amazing Spider-Man Lethal Foes was only released in Japan on the Super Famicom. And that doesn't mean much until you see it in action, and you realize it is absolutely the best Spider-Man game to hit consoles until Spider-Man for the PS1 released in '99. And I say that as a huge fan of the Sega Genesis and Sega CD Spider-Man vs. Kingpin games. It had everything you could want in a Spider-Man game. Great web swinging, wall crawling, huge sprites, and all of Spidey's rogues gallery waiting to smash your head in. I mean, every bad guy is pretty much present and accounted for in this adventure. Beetle, Lizard, Mysterio, Venom, Carnage, Alistair Smythe, Doc Ock, Green Goblin, and more. The only thing that brings this incredible game down, in my eyes, is the ever-present timer countdown for each level, which limits exploration and doesn't let you enjoy the sights for very long. Sega of Japan definitely hated Spider-Man Lethal Foes, and if I had seen this back in '95, I would have hated Nintendo for not releasing it in North America. There are multitudes of Super Nintendo RPGs I could include on this list, but there is one game released almost 30 years ago that is still held in such high regard that if I left it out, people would riot in the streets of the internet. Its title? Chrono Trigger, released by Square. Good luck playing it on a real cart, though. Unlike your mom, this one ain't cheap to bring home. Are we still doing mom jokes? Okay. Prices for just this game alone start a couple $100, and if you want a boxed or graded copy, oh man. Chrono Trigger may not look like much today. In fact, it looks a lot like every other top-down JRPG you've seen from that era. And if you spent as much time as I did playing my son's RPG Maker creations, you'd probably say, nah, I'm good, when someone like me tries to convince you to play it. Chrono Trigger manages to get everything right, except in my opinion, the pacing at first. And it's definitely what I'd call a slog, for the first while. But stay with it, and your tune will change as the game opens up dramatically and thematically. And I'm sorry, the plot's off limits. I cannot and will not spoil this game, even though it's decades old. Sharp, colorful graphics, the fast-paced turn-based combat, The decision to forego annoying random counters so you can really get around on that world map, great boss battles, excellent music, and a story that digs much deeper than you'd ever imagine while providing multiple endings are a few of the reasons why CT continues to be mentioned on lists of the greatest RPGs ever made. Sega's Phantasy Star 2 was definitely a force in the early 90s that helped usher in a new era of RPG fans, but games like Chrono Trigger cemented the Super Nintendo's legacy as the system where true RPG fans came to play. And that's why Sega hated Chrono Trigger. Super Ghouls and Ghosts is the third entry into the series, and at that time it was only available on the Super Nintendo, which meant if you wanted to play, well, you're not dumb. Okay, so I would have bought a Super Nintendo anyway to play it, but luckily I already owned one. This third entry is one of the hardest, especially if you grew up accustomed to the up and down shooting of the arcade/Genesis version, only to find out that nope, it's back to traditional side-to-side shooting only in this game. But you can double jump. Well, and that real-time transforming terra firma, that was wild. This insanely difficult game was released on the Game Boy Advance years later, and I purchased 10 copies of it out of my own pocket for my review team when I was the site director for Cheat Code Central, cheatcc.com. One of my favorite stories to tell was my 3-year-old son really wanted to play it on the Game Boy Advance, so I let him. A while later, he comes into the meeting, and we're sitting there with a handful of writers, and he says, "What do you do at the water level?" And a couple of my top reviewers scoffed and said, "There's no water level, kid." And then they looked at his screen and realized they hadn't even reached the level with the big wave that washes away the ground. My 3-year-old son was a better player than all of us. And from my experiences at E3, I discovered game reviewers can write, but they sure can't play. And that's why you don't listen to reviews. Super Ghouls and Ghosts was a masterpiece and a love letter to those of us who truly love the series. And I'm so thankful that new entries such as Ghosts and Goblins Resurrection actually exist. But back in fall of 1991, it was Sega's turn to hate Nintendo for giving gamers an entirely terrifying reason to purchase their new system. Full disclosure, I'm a Street Fighter guy, not a Mortal Kombat, Fatal Fury, Art of Fighting, Night Stalkers, or even a Killer Instinct kind of guy. But hey, some people are. The rare developed Killer Instinct is still highly regarded. In fact, Arcade 1UP recently released a Killer Instinct cab and a larger Pro model of its home version arcade series. The Arcade KI was brought to life by Ken Lobb, who began development of the title at Namco, but they passed on it. Lobb took it to Nintendo of America, who hired him as the head developer, and then Lobb made his way over to England to join Rare. Some of you might remember this gun from GoldenEye and Perfect Dark, named after the man himself. But sorry, it wasn't a great gun, Ken. The Super Nintendo version is particularly noteworthy because Nintendo was making a real attempt to shake its kiddo-friendly tame typecasting, and with the new ESRB ratings around the corner, KI would be developed with as much blood and violence as the name suggested, without getting parents and video game violence activists up in arms. While KI looks like a Mortal Kombat wannabe, because I'm pretty sure it is a Mortal Kombat wannabe, Killer Instinct actually does some cool things. Each character gets 2 health bars, and the battle is over for whomever's is drained first. Tons of wild-looking characters, voice samples, automatic combos, mappable controls, and a practice stage made the Super Nintendo arcade port a bona fide hit with over 3.5 million carts sold in its lifetime. And let's face it, Sega hated Killer Instinct for being so deliciously violent on a kiddie game console. As I mentioned last episode, in the 80s and 90s, if it wasn't Spider-Man or X-Men,
It's clap!
but that was then and this is now. X-Men are working their way into the MCU, but they've definitely taken a backseat to other heroes in the Marvel Universe. It would be unfathomable to a kid who grew up in the 80s that movies based on Iron Man, Thor, Captain America, and the Avengers exist today. Never mind Guardians of the Galaxy, Black Panther, Black Widow, and Ant-Man? Ant-Man? Ant-Man 3?
Excelsior!
Capcom held a license with Marvel due to its arcade fighting games based on the properties, and so it branched off into the side-scrolling beat-em-ups for the consoles. And the console of choice? Super Nintendo. X-Men Mutant Apocalypse, released in '94 on the SNES, and choosing between the game's 5 characters, Beast, Cyclops, Gambit, Psylocke, and Wolverine, and who else, each of whom had their own dedicated levels. Once the first 5 levels were completed, the game gave you some freedom of choice, not to mention a password feature, and let you select your favorite character, do battle some bosses, take on Omega Red and Juggernaut in the Danger Room, and then, of course, on to the ultimate showdown with old, what's his name there, the magnetic guy. Mutant Apocalypse was an absolute blast, and was well received back then, and still is, frankly, thanks in no small part to the crisp graphics, the interesting movesets, and attention to detail to the characters and their powers that mimic their comic counterparts. Yeah, sure, Sega X-Men fans were also receiving adventures on the Genesis console, and those were great in their own right. I mean, I included them last episode, but they weren't getting Capcom-developed beat-em-ups that featured movesets that they could use in the arcade X-Men fighting games and this game at home. Many of Marvel's top-tier properties today were decidedly second and third tier back then, including the Avengers. Imagine an Avengers game where you battle it out with Thanos for the Infinity Gems. Now take Captain America, Hulk, Iron Man, and include Spidey and Wolverine. Now ask Capcom nicely to make that game with many of the moves from their arcade fighter Marvel superheroes. You see where I'm going with this? War of the Gems ticked all the boxes for gamers looking for some superhero action, and it's the Avengers Infinity War game based on the comics that you did get, but the movie game you never got, but kinda sorta did almost 30 years ago. Imagine being so ahead of the curve, you're making games that'll be relevant 27 years in the future to an entirely different generation. And that's why Sega hated X-Men Mutant Apocalypse and Marvel Heroes War of the Gems. As we head on out of here, here's a few special mentions, and in some cases perhaps hidden gems that would have at least certainly pissed Sega off. Konami's Axel A takes a page from the old 1942 arcade games and takes the action vertical while playing on a horizontal screen. This intensely difficult but scenic space shooter features ships that are configured with 3 weapons from the outset that are upgraded throughout the game, and players will have to switch between them on the fly to survive. Shoot-em-ups were all the rage back in the 90s, and Axel A was one of the finest on the Super Nintendo. A 2-player racing game that uses unicycles? Okay, 90s, what kind of drugs were you on? This trippy, addictive gem from DMA Design, which later became Rockstar, is one of the strangest and unique racing games you'll play, but you can't deny its charms, of which there are many. Racing relies on stunts, which propels the disembodied unicycles faster around those weird tracks. It may not win for the best background design, but the tracks, control, music, and edge-of-your-seat racing combine to make Uniracers a definite must-play. Courtesy of the Super Nintendo's Mode 7 architecture, this arcade port of Camel Tree, called On the Ball, is one of the most satisfying and intense puzzle games you'll come across. Your job is to move the environment to allow the ball to reach the goal, and it's easy enough at first, but the challenge ramps up. You put this game on in a room full of people, and you'll have everyone clamoring for just one more try. Please! Seriously, great game. Wild Guns flew under a lot of people's radar, myself included, because it looked like a Me Too version of the arcade shooter Cabal. But it's much, much more than that. It's a steampunk western shooting gallery with either Clint or Annie, or together in 2-player. Must use the D-pad to aim the cursor and defeat waves of bad guys, robots, and bosses. This game is action-packed and a fantastic example of a genre that you didn't think you'd like until you play it. Taito's triple-screen arcade game Ninja Warriors from 1987 received a cleverly titled sequel called The Ninja Warriors for the Super Nintendo in '94. This home console game continues the action with 3 selectable android ninjas. And while it looks like a simple beat 'em up, Natsumi opened up the hood of each android ninja and jam-packed in a plethora of exciting moves for you to discover on your own. Or if you're, one of those Brainiac type gamers, you could just read the manual provided, I guess. If you find the arcade version a slog, there's a lot to love in this wildly entertaining sequel. And while we're on the subject of robot ninjas, it'd be remiss of me not to mention this hidden Super Nintendo gem, Hagani, The Final Conflict. Lots of great moves, exciting gameplay, and challenge up the wazoo. Hagani, The Final Conflict is a must-play if you can find it. And that's a big game over, good buddy, on this episode of Backed by Popular Demand. Thanks for sticking around, and please join me after the show in the comments section for refreshments, autographs, and awkward conversation. And before we go, let me just ask, if you aren't retro gaming, what are you doing? I'll see you next time, friends.
A Winner Is You Productions.